Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And we'll be joined by Faisal Islam shortly because there's a story with lots of numbers and even more politics and even more passion attached to it, which we will talk about in the second half. But the first half is, I'm trying to think, Chris, of an adjective to describe this back and forth between Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson's lawyers, and the Speaker of the House of Commons about Lord Mandelson's arrest, which happened very publicly the other day.
Yeah, bizarre, I think is probably the best word. So if you think of the Lord Mandelson story of the last, a week or month or whatever time frame you put to it, this is kind of Chapter 5B or whatever, or maybe it's 55B. Now, I don't mean by that you should turn off, because newscasters, I think you'll delight in some of the details of all of this. But the big development in the last 24 hours or so was the news that the police had decided to arrest Lord Mandelson because of the suggestion that he might leave the country. What we've now found out is who it was who told them that they thought or had evidence that he might do that. And that guy is the Speaker of the House of Commons. The added twist is it looks like there was some mistaken identity thrown into the mix, and the geographical epicentre of this story, in an unlikely twist, is the British Virgin Islands.
And this is how Sir Lindsay Hoyle explained all of this in a limited way to MPs at the start of Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday lunchtime.
Members will be aware of comments in the media regarding the arrest of Lord Mandelson. To prevent any inaccurate speculation, I'd like to confirm that upon receipt of information that I felt it was relevant, I passed this on to the Metropolitan Police in good faith, as is my duty and responsibility. It is regrettable this rapidly ended in the media, as this is a live investigation. Members will understand that it would not be appropriate to make any further comment, and I'd like to caution members from doing so.
Okay, quite a lot to unpack there. So, it was parliamentary half-term last week, so it would not be a crime for somebody at Westminster to go on holiday. Was Lindsay Hoyle on holiday in the British Virgin Islands?
He was on a work trip,
right?
So he was seeing kind of his opposite numbers and politicians in the British Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, about 4,000 miles away from Westminster, and that had been publicly announced in advance that he was going to do this kind of thing. It's the sort of thing that speakers do in their line of work. They go to other kind of parliamentary democracies and meet people and all that kind of stuff. So we know that he was doing that visit to Lindsay Hoyle between Monday and Thursday of last week, and we know that Peter Mandelson was arrested on Monday tea time. We also know through Peter Mandelson's lawyers that Lord Mandelson, was expecting to voluntarily attend an interview with the police in March, so relatively soon, but not immediately. And his lawyers have made it clear that it was completely wrong to assume that he was planning to leave the country either permanently or temporarily. The twist was that last night, so we're recording at early evening on Wednesday. On Tuesday evening, the Lord Speaker, a guy called Michael Forsyth, Lord Forsyth, put out a statement in which he said, "I've got absolutely nothing to do with all of this." And at the time, no one quite joined the dots to think, well, maybe the police force have got the wrong speaker at Westminster. And then at lunchtime today, we get Lindsay Hoyle saying what you've just heard, and now the Metropolitan Police apologising. They've been to see Lindsay Hoyle and have apologised. You heard a polite version of his frustration, Lindsay Hoyle's frustration, in that clip there, and the Met are now saying they have apologised to the Speaker of the House of Commons this afternoon for inadvertently revealing information during an investigation into allegations of misconduct in public office. So clearly Lindsay Hoyle a little piqued that this has become public. We also understand that the Met had kind of stress tested the information they received before deciding that it was sensible, in their view, to arrest Lord Mandelson. What we don't know is what that information was.
I think what's interesting for me is that initially this seems like are we in a new kind of territory when it comes to criminal investigations, where people start issuing statements on the record or to their friends about what's going on, and then you have the Speaker talking about it in the House of Commons trying to clear up the things. But then you think about it a bit more and you realise actually these are not comments on the investigation or a potential crime or anyone's guilt or innocence or anything that's going to be put in front of a jury and a court if ever there's a prosecution or someone's charged. This is actually comments on just the almost like the soap opera of around the criminal investigation.
Yeah.
So that's why it's maybe a little bit more fair game for people talking about.
Yeah, so I don't think this changes any of the fundamentals of the story. I mean, I think what is curious is how Lord Mandelson's lawyers. So I understand that Lord Mandelson's lawyers were twice told that the Lord Speaker, Lord Forsyth, was the source of the tip-off that the Metropolitan Police acted upon. We now know, because he said it out loud, that it was the Commons Speaker, and we'd already heard from Lord Forsyth that it wasn't him. So it's curious that Peter Mandelson's lawyers would find out about the Metropolitan Police's sources, but as you say, and the Met have since apologised around how all of this has kind of, burst out publicly. But as you say, none of this is about the fundamentals of the inquiry that the Metropolitan Police continue with, which is investigating this suspicion of misconduct in public office in connection to those files that were published a few weeks back now relating to Jeffrey Epstein.
And okay, Lord Mandelson's lawyers have let it be known what they feel has gone on over the last 24 hours. But just remind us what we think Lord Mandelson's position is on this.
Yeah, in the interest of fairness, Lord Mandelson has not himself commented publicly in the last few weeks. As you say, there has been some commentary from his lawyers about the process, if you like. But on the big picture, my understanding is that it is his view that he has not acted in any way criminally and did not act for his own financial gain.
And just another little update on a political story. The government's deal with Mauritius for them to take over sovereignty of the Chagos Islands, where the British military base Diego Garcia is part of it. And it will involve the UK leasing back the military base for 100 years. Has that been paused? Or is it still going ahead? Or are both those things true simultaneously this evening?
Right. So here is the potted summary of this, which was happening in the midst of all of this stuff about Lord Mandelson and the Metropolitan Police. So the government says there is no pause in its Chagos Islands deal, despite the fact that the Foreign Office Minister Hamish Falconer, who was answering questions from MPs, said the UK was, quote, pausing the process while discussions happened with the United States. So a minister said there was a pause. The government then said there wasn't a pause.
What do we make of that? That's it?
What we make of it is that they're in a colossal bind because the Trump administration keep changing their mind about what they make of this deal. That, I think, is the bottom line of all of this. Yes, there's a domestic political row about whether this deal over the Chagos Islands is a wise one, is a good one. But the bottom line in terms of what causes them a lot of grief at the moment is we have seen repeatedly, because it's not just been America originally said A and now it's saying B. It's sort of flip-flop between those two places several times. That is what is at the crux of all of this, and not for the first time, but it is a case study in London, peering across the Atlantic towards Washington and not quite knowing what on earth President Trump is going to say next.
I wonder, though, for what it's worth here, is that there was always going to be a gap as this deal went through its process through Parliament. It's just a question of what that gap is being used for. Maybe in a world if Kamala Harris was US president, that would just be a normal gap in Parliament, like there exists for lots of things. But because Donald Trump is president, that gap is maybe being used to try and sweet talk the Americans back on board. I
think there's a fair amount of all of that. And then this topic is very live domestically and very live internationally. So every word, including today's word beginning with P, is scrutinised to the nth degree.
Now, let's welcome Faisal Islam back to the Newscast studio. Hello, Faisal.
Hello, Adam.
Right. This story has been brewing for a while, and we haven't really covered it on Newscast because it never quite hit the threshold of kind of the news that day. But it did today because it came up at Prime Minister's Questions, and it is student loans for former students in England who were studying between 2012 and 2023. Chris, just set the scene for how this then sort of exploded into Prime Minister's Questions.
Yeah, so the Conservatives for a little while now have been having a run at this, and the crux of this is there are a whole bunch of former students who have a fair chunk of debt, and even though they may be paying it off or paying a certain amount per month in an attempt to pay it off, their mountain of debt is actually growing, which clearly politically is an awkward spot to be in when you have former students saying, hang on a minute, this surely isn't fair. The other couple of things I think worth mentioning is, one, crucially, a whole chunk of people who are in that category have become, if you like, have come of political age. So there's loads of MPs who are in that situation. There's loads of people in and around Westminster in all sorts of other sort of influential jobs who are in that situation. So I think that raises its salience. And then the second point is, broadly speaking, if Labour hope to hold together a kind of voter coalition, at any encounter with the electorate, broadly speaking, people in this situation are likely to be a reasonable chunk of it. In other words, trying to keep them on side is probably important. And the indications, both publicly at Prime Minister's Questions, but then also in the conversations that we have with the Prime Minister's team, is that they are trying to work out what to do about this. The indication is they want to try and do something about this. It's not necessarily easy for all sorts of reasons that Faisal can no doubt talk about in the context of the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and, tight budgets, etc., etc. But there seems to be a keen awareness of the problem within government and a desire to do something about it. What we don't know is precisely what, when, and how.
And we'll talk about possible and rival fixes in a second. But Faisal, the actual change that we're talking about here was introduced in the budget last year. Not much fanfare on the day itself. A lot of fanfare since, though. Just explain the changes to the so-called Plan 2 system that Rachel Reeves and her colleagues introduced.
So the key feature of this is that there's a threshold which, after you've graduated, you have to earn before you start repaying back a relatively high rate of interest. And that is just under £30,000. And normally that would have gone up with earnings. But the Chancellor chose, I think it was to increase it for 1 year, but then freeze it just under 30,000, which means that more and more people, as incomes go up, as wages go up, would be caught with having to pay this back at what would be, in real terms, a relatively smaller wage. And it would take up a significant proportion of their income. So that's what happened. That was the choice that was made by the Chancellor. As you said, there was many things going on in that budget, but it did certainly raise my eyebrow amongst the chaos of the leaked OBR document on the day, as you remember.
And the 100 other measures that were in there.
Indeed. And so, that's of real, it's of real concern. And if we go back in the history of all of this, the creation of the student loan scheme, and I remember going back to the sort of Tony Blair government here, there was a big debate about whether you have a graduate tax or you have a loan system, and there were consequences for the public finances that were really arcane but that had some substantial impact on how you treat this. But essentially, it boils down to this, is if you had a graduate tax or something like a graduate tax, people shouldn't feel put off by the amount of the debt. It's a sort of notional debt, isn't real. It only becomes active.
Don't focus on the number.
Yeah.
Focus on how much you're repaying every month.
Yeah, but we have a loan system, and the more the threshold is lowered, effectively in real terms, the more it feels like a real debt that you will have to pay back. And it doesn't feel like a graduate tax. It doesn't feel optional. And I think that's the sort of situation that they're concerned about. And they're concerned not just for the solvency of those previous students, but for the attractiveness of the further education, tertiary education in general. The Conservatives obviously come up with this plan where you somehow recycle the money from less popular courses they were lighted upon like creative
Yeah,
arts.
but so
for
the issue we've
example.
got is it's neither a loan, but it is a loan. It's not a tax, but it is a tax. And also, Chris, because of an interview that the schools minister gave to Victoria Derbyshire on Newsnight earlier this week, it now no longer is purely designed to fund higher education. Because she said, Georgia Gould, this is to do with all the other spending pressures that the government is under, which then allows Kemi Badenoch at Prime Minister's Questions to say, the system was sold as paying for universities and helping to stop them go bust, but actually it's paying, in her words, for benefits.
Indeed, and so that becomes another strand in the Conservative argument. The Conservatives are absolutely of the view that they want to pick up and run with this and carry on asking plenty of questions. They detect that the government is going to move. That may or may not, depending on what happens, allow them to claim that it might be another about turn, etc., in the knockabout of the politics of all of this. And as I say, the indicators, both publicly and then in the background chats, pointing in the direction of the government doing something, but then that poses difficult questions for Rachel Reeves and for Keir Starmer about how you do it and with what consequence, what are the trade-offs, etc., etc.
Yeah, and I spoke to the Chancellor on other topics on the energy price today, but I did throw in a couple of questions, and she certainly did seem in keeping with the idea that things are being looked at. And it's interesting because I think only last month she was sort of ruling it out and defending it. She said, of course, we'll continue to look at how we can make sure the system works. But she also mentioned that part of the problem is the threshold that I just talked about, but obviously part of the problem is the high interest rate as well, which is pegged to
the retail prices
price index, exactly,
plus 3%,
exactly, which is a higher and somewhat arcane and old form of inflation that the government doesn't use anymore. But she said that because inflation was coming down, because interest rates were coming down, the overall interest payments, that was her answer, would also come down. So the high levels we've seen are going to sort of flush out of the system because of the general macroeconomic recovery as she sees it. That was her answer. But I did detect exactly what Chris has just said in her answer, some willingness to look at something. My question would be, is this a tweak of the sort she's being lobbied to do by either the Conservatives or campaigners like Martin Lewis, or is it something more substantial? Because it's very intriguing, the political economy of this, isn't it, to have the Conservatives sort of try and appeal counterintuitively to this younger voting demographic.
Because they're the party of the triple lock for pensions.
Well, and you're starting to see also this demographic assert itself, become the key middle-aged, dare I say it, demographic. I think they'll say it like that. Demographic that determines and decides elections.
Than everyone thinks.
What is this generation? Is that a millennial or is that Gen
it's
something?
It's millennials, yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, they will determine. They'll be the key swing voters in elections. The Conservatives are making I don't know. What does Chris think? A pitch for them because reform has taken away the older voters. I don't know. It's intriguing to think that they will be in play when we assume maybe they're more in play for the Green Party. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's intriguing. Someone was reflecting on just this to me earlier today here, saying that on the one hand, you can see the logic in Kemi Badenoch having a run at this because she detects, as she would see it, an injustice and also the potential for the government to change its mind in some way or change its outlook. But that actually securing that change might ultimately be more beneficial to the Labour Party than it is to the Conservatives if you reassure those who might broadly, so at least some of them, be inclined to back you as the Labour Party, but they're not so keen if the sort of debt mountain is piling up. But if the government does something about it, maybe you're one back round.
And so just to be clear about what the various options floating around are. So Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives are saying use a lower interest rate that feels less punitive to the people paying back the loans. Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert, says actually, no, it's more about the thresholds at which people start repaying it. Those are the two big options.
We should chuck in another option, which we've seen increasingly in American politics, which is just cancellation of some of these debts. Are they going to become onerous? We can't detach this from the reality, which is the returns to this university education has, for many people that have these debts, not been what was promised, right? The value of a university education, and that was even before we start talking about the impact of AI on entry-level jobs. This is really going to mess with the economics of all of this big time. You're suddenly thinking, well, hang on a minute, that entire route straight from being a graduate into a medium earning job that promises to be a high earning job that gets you a mortgage and buys you a house, a flat, and then a house. That entire route, each sort of journey point, waypoint on that route is up for question right now. And so does it work? Does the idea of a loan system function and work? There are much bigger questions and a changed environment for young people generally that is now being reflected not just in this fiscal maths here, but also, as Chris has pointed out, in the politics of this.
And also, Faisal, you quoted the Tony Blair years, but Chris, I mean, we were just starting out when this was a big deal. And there was protests in Whitehall and students chucking stuff and getting imprisoned and throwing off smoke bombs outside the Conservative Central Office, wasn't there, when this was introduced?
Absolutely, I remember those moments kind of very keenly, because some of those protests were, I mean, to put it gently, quite something. So
it was kind of the wildest Whitehall has ever got.
Well,
really.
Yes. I mean, it probably is. So yeah, the various incarnations of this row that has gone on for more than a generation now around the funding of higher education and who should pick up the tab and when, and how the sort of societal distribution of that should be, because you'll have people who make the argument that over time, certainly historically over time, those who go to university on average earn more over a career than those that don't, has been the historic argument, and therefore why should all of society, if you like, pay for the benefit only garnered by a certain proportion. But at the same time, yeah, absolutely, this argument around where things are now, and then crucially how governments decide, as Faisal was reflecting on a few minutes ago, how governments decide to brand things. And hence this idea of when is a debt, when is it a graduate tax? But the word tax is one not a word that politicians will gladly use enthusiastically most of the time. But would a billing of it in a different way at the outset have made things easier to sell in this situation now? Maybe.
Faisal, you mentioned your chat with Rachel Reeves. You cannot but help, when you watch it on TV, think of a particular energy company because she was doing it at the HQ of Octopus, and there's just Octopus branding everywhere, and there's even like stuffed octopuses in the background as well. It does look a bit like an advert. And that was because the Ofgem announced the new level of the price cap for domestic energy bills in a few months' time. What's your take on that? Because it's going down, and it's going down by more than £100 for the average household, even though that number is kind of meaningless because everyone's energy bill is different in a different way.
Yeah, it's a substantial and real cut by the standards of these moves. It's on electricity bills specifically, and so there will be a differential impact depending on if you've got an electric car, if you have a gas boiler, all that sort of stuff. And I think what was notable for me was it was unusual, right? This is a direct result of a strategy from government.
Yes, because this wasn't the usual thing of, the wholesale markets that the energy companies buy their power on have changed. We're going to pass that on to the consumer. This was actually government policies.
Yeah, and it wasn't. They specifically sought out policies. So we're going back to September. They sought out the Treasury policies that would yield this sort of impact, that would enable the Chancellor to do the sort of interview she did with me today, and that would have a tangible impact on the overall rate of inflation, which this will, when we get the figures, I think, in May for April. It could even bring it down to at or below the Bank of England's target of 2%. And that's unusual, to sort of use the levers of the Treasury and tax policy, essentially, to shift this into the tax system away from your bill to try and manage the actual inflation rate. That is actually what we have seen. And in turn, to get a sort of double whammy, because you will get interest rate cuts because inflation is lower, although there are some doubts about that, but that's the theory, and we may well see that in the next few weeks. So, but I thought what was intriguing was the attempt to sort of sew this together with a broader story. Although there's a lot of doom-mongery around about the economy, literally in the last few days, we have seen some numbers on retail sales, surveys of economic activity. We've seen borrowing numbers, borrowing costs, a couple of other metrics that are going in not just slightly turning, but going in a fundamentally better direction. On the other hand, we've had sluggish growth figures at the end of last year. We've had unemployment going up, particularly we've been talking about young people. But you can see them attempting to use this as a launching pad for an attempt to G up business confidence and consumer confidence.
Well, and it's interesting you say that because it stopped raining. I've been cycling more the last few days. I mean, I know, Faisal, you're not a fair weather cyclist. You've been cycling throughout. I've gone back on the bike in the last few days, and you see everywhere on the digital billboards an advert for the great giant rail fare freeze.
Yeah.
It's really the adverts are absolutely everywhere.
That's a public sector. That's a governmental thing.
It's
right?
another budget measure that is now taking effect now, and which the government just wants to whack everyone around the chops with as happening.
And I'm going to try and tie both of those things together. It's fascinating, that point about the billboards, Adam. And then the language that the Chancellor, Faisal, was using to you, talking about we're beginning to turn a corner. And then you take that language and you look at the argument the Prime Minister was making at Prime Minister's Questions today, where he was teasing Kemi Badenoch, saying a couple of weeks ago, all you wanted to talk about was the economy. Now I want to talk about the economy, and reeling off some of these metrics. And then you rewind to the very beginning of this calendar year, where the government launched the very campaign that you've been seeing as you've been peddling in the sunshine, Adam, around rail fares, and the frustration within government that the 1,000,001 things that have happened in the news in the last 7 or 8 weeks have kind of drowned that story out, whether it be Greenland or tariffs or Venezuela or Peter Mandelson or the former Prince Andrew, etc., etc. And I just detect a sense. I detected a frustration from some very senior ministers a few weeks ago when they were seeing some of these economic indicators, but didn't think. Well, they just knew there was no bandwidth to talk about them because everything else was going on. And now they're tentatively stepping into wanting to sound a bit more positive. But as ever with political leaders, knowing that they need to do that tentatively because clearly not everything is rosy, and they wouldn't want people thinking, oh, hang on a minute, they're all sounding super, super optimistic and bouncy and things are actually quite difficult. But speaking to people in government, they really think things could just about, well, as the Chancellor puts it, beginning to turn.
Right. That's it for this episode of Newscast. Faisal, thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
Chris, thanks to you too.
Ta-ra.
And just to say, just before we started recording, the Ministry of Justice sent out the details of the new courts bill, the actual legislation, which will put in place all the stuff that David Lammy was talking about on the previous episode of Newscast. And so if you haven't heard that and you want to understand some of the battles ahead and some of the potential changes to the court system in England and Wales, it's worth listening to what David Lammy said to me and Chris in the previous episode. That's all for this one, though. Bye-bye.